Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we are gonna be looking at some very interesting input handlers. But if you remember from last video, we were working on the builder script here to allow us to instantiate and basically position prefabs in the scene in-game so we can actually build things in the game. Let's just quickly jump into play mode and see what we have today. Okay, I'm gonna move this so you can see the scene, even though you cannot see exactly what I'm seeing in the headset, but hopefully this should be a better view. So I'll just type the regular, resetting the scene. You can actually see the hands in VR. Now I have set things up so that with the press of a button, now we can instantiate prefab. And with another press of a button, we have a successful build where we have pine and another one, and another one, and as many as I need, all at the press of a button. I can actually very quickly create a small forest here. Isn't that cool? You can see here more from the view from the headset how it looks. It's pretty straightforward. You can see pine. I can cancel it if I want to, or I can confirm it if I want to as well. And it's all pretty quickly, just a couple of presses of a button, and I have a forest. Cool. So let's look at how that's done. All right, I'm gonna get out of play mode here. You can, before I go, you can see here all the pines that we instantiated here. For now, they're just going to the hierarchy. We'll later put them in a better place. Oh, but that's all very cool. Now let's look at what actually changed. So if you remember, we have the builder script. This is all the same. We have array caster script that is casting array from the hand, and if it intersects with a buildable object, then it will set the raycast hit to true and the raycast hit position to the point where it intersects with the ground. And we use those two variables here in the builder script to define where we want to position the prefab and whether we need to draw it or not. Because if we don't have a hit, then we don't need to draw the prefab. And it has a preview material that you were seeing, this transparent material, while it's in preview, while you're setting the prefab, and then once you confirm it, it gets back the original prefab material, which in this case was the nice brown for the trunk and the dark green for the leaves. That's what we have. The cool thing today is this, the input handler. And this is how we are handling the input in the game now, and it has a few things here. First, the input handler is basically an array of input events, and then it keeps track of the current game state. An input event, and we'll see that in code very soon, but an input event has three main components, maybe four. The first component, the most important, is the event itself. What happens when we trigger the input? We can see here, we have a build confirm input. And the input is the second component, but when we trigger the build confirm input, you can see here, it's the primary index trigger in the right touch controller. When we trigger that input, first we go to the builder object and we call the build method, which is basically what sets the prefab as a permanent position. It just changes the material to the original material and then stops moving the prefab around. Then we have here an update for the debug text that we have floating around in front of the player, and we said that the build was successful. And then we change the game state back to neutral. We'll talk a little bit more about game states here. Then we have the second element is the input, as I mentioned, and the third element here is the target state. This is the state in the game in which this input is valid. Because we don't have that many inputs in the controller, we want to make sure that we're able to make the best out of them. And one of the things is making sure that the inputs only trigger during the right state. You can think about it for different games. For example, a sandbox game like GTA, you have a different inputs when you're on foot than when you are inside a car or when you're swimming or when you're inside a menu. All of these different states map to similar inputs, but inputs have different effects depending on which state you have or you're in. So similarly here, we're saying for the building state, if we trigger the build confirm input, then execute this event or invoke this event. And then we have a couple more helpers here. We have a skip other input boolean here. That's set to true for most of them, which basically if we hit this input, stop checking the other inputs. This prevents loops where one input sets the state for another input that has the same mapping. So if you have one after the other, you could basically trigger both in the same loop, and you wouldn't want that for some of them. So that's why we have the skip other input here. Then we have this other helper here is trigger on any state. If we don't have a particular game state that we want to trigger, for example, there's this reload input here that we want to be able to reload the scene with the push of a button. And we want to be able to do that from any state in any situation. So that's why I have it here, trigger on any state. And then the final component is the input type. And this is just so that we can actually decide whether we want to trigger the input when the button is first pressed, when the button is let go, or whenever the button is held down. Those are the three choices here. And actually for these ones, it actually should be on up. So building confirm, building abort, that should be an up, this one should be an up, and I'm going to make the reload input on up as well. So that they only trigger when we actually release the button, not the first time you press it down. Because none of these need to be that fast. We actually want to be able to confirm and yeah, it just, as a player, it feels better if it only takes effect once you release the button, not the first time you press it. But you can tweak this around. That's the main portion that I want to cover here. So let's go into the code here so we can see that. So as I mentioned before, the input handler here is a mono behavior that has an array of input events, and then it keeps track of the current game state. And the way that this works is that for every input event in the array, we check the input, and then with the current state that we're keeping track of. And if we want to skip the other input, then we just break out of this loop. If not, we just go through the loop all the time. But you can see that we're accessing the input event here. So let's look at what the input event has for us. This one is a little bit more interesting. We have here an enum for the different input types that we saw. If we want to check on the first time the button is pressed, when the button is let go, or whenever it's being held. And then we have the actual input event class here. It has a unity event. This is what's actually getting invoked when we trigger the input. We have this boolean for skipping other input, as mentioned before. And then we have the actual input that we're looking for, what state we're targeting, so in which state it's active. We have this helper if we want to trigger on any state. And then we have what type of input we want to check when we're checking for this input. And then we have the public method, the check input state, and the check input method where we're checking against the current state. So you can see here, if it's not triggering on any state, if we haven't set the trigger on any state flag to be true, or if the target state is not the same as the current state, then we just get out of this. We say, hey, no, not even checking the input. It's just not part of the condition. So for example, we saw here that the build inputs are targeting the building game state. So if we're not in the building game state, we don't even need to check for these inputs. It doesn't matter. We're not going to do anything about it. But if we are either on any state or the current state matches the target state, then we check for the input. So we say, hey, if the input type is on down, then we check for the get down method here. And we can see here from before that the scriptable object, the input config, has this setup, what button we want to check for on which controller. Then it surfaces these three methods, the get down, get up, or get. And this map to the OVR input class that has the mapping of get down with the input and the controller. So this is an abstraction of that. So we check for that and we do these three checks. Just if it's on up, then check for up. If it's on down, check on down. And if it's on hold, check on get. If any of those is true, then we invoke the input event or the on input event, and then we return true. Otherwise, we return false. And we use that, as you saw before here, to say if we actually trigger the input and then we know that we want to skip any other input, then we get out of the loop. And then one thing that we saw there was the Gamestate Object. You saw here that we are having a target state and we are also keeping track of the current state. But all of these are Gamestate objects, and this is a scriptable object. It is super straightforward. We're just checking against string here, and we have a way of setting one state to be the same as another state. It's just basically copying the name over. This is not particularly tricky behavior, but it allows us to do a bunch of cool things. If we go here to the scriptable object and define a number of game states here, right? The building one that we're using now for whenever we're building something. We have this one interacting with NPC that we'll use later for whenever we're dealing with the merchant, for example. And then we have the neutral state, which is just the regular in-game state. We may later rename this to something more useful, but in general, it's just whenever nothing is particularly happening or we're not in any particular state, it's going to be the neutral state. And we can have different state, for example, like the intro scene or whatever, the main menu. Game state could be here, and that could have its own input if we wanted, all of that. Again, it depends on how you want to build it, but that's how it's set up. And that is the main thing. Here we're leveraging a bunch of other objects and mono behaviors that we've seen in the past. Many of these are already defined, like the debug text scriptable object was already defined in a previous video. These input config scriptable objects were also defined in a previous video. The game state is new, but in general, this is again building on top of blocks that already existed and just constructing on top of them to make them even better. And that's basically it. We'll just take a quick look again so you can see now that you know how it's constructed. See it in action again. You can see my hands, and then press one button. I enter the building mode. I can define the tree and I want to place it there. Build successful. Set a few others here very quickly, and then if I want to, I can also use the same input and cancel out of the build, right? It's all there. So that's how that works. Hopefully it was useful to you. I really like the way that the input handler ended up shaping it. It's very powerful. You can just add any kind of event to any kind of input, and this allows you to not have to check for input in every specific mono behavior. You can see here that I disabled the inventory UI enabler that we were working on a previous video, but you can see here the anti-pattern that we had before, where we have a specific mono behavior that checks for a specific input and then does some behavior on top of that whenever we have that input. This is the anti-pattern because you end up with a bunch of these different mono behaviors for every specific thing, and then if we want to add state to this one, we need to keep passing the current state around, and it just gets really messy really fast. So having the ability to track all the input in one place and handle it in one place gives us more flexibility. For example, this skip other input ability here, that is just not really possible if you have the distributed input checking in different mono behaviors. But in general, just having this one object that tracks all the inputs is very cool. Obviously, it can get a little bit unwieldy if you have, let's say, 4 different states in the game, and each state has 6 or 7 different inputs that you want to track or different things. That quickly becomes a huge list, and then we'll get into how do you actually save this out and serialize it and all that, so that you can keep it as maybe as a separate asset that you don't have to tie to the player prefab here, for example. But we'll talk about that at a later date. For now, there's a few things that are missing that I'll cover in the next video. There's still some things that we want to do with the colliders when we're building, for example. I want to make sure that we disable the colliders so we're not pushing the player. If you are trying to position a prefab too close to the player or something like that, we need to have a way of checking if there are overlapping prefabs so that we cannot place one prefab on top of another unless we want to allow for that. But there's a few other things that we could be doing with the build system to make it a bit more robust. In any case, that will be it for now. I think it's a very cool system. Even if you're not using it for building, just the general input handler pattern could be very powerful. So I suggest you take a look and try to use it in your projects as well. But yeah, that's it for now. Thank you so much for sticking with me, and I hope you learned something in this video. I'll see you in the next one.